this is a story about opportunities in early New Zealand. And anyone who's been to the States can't but have heard them talking about the American dream. And the American dream was immigrants came to the States, worked hard, did well, and prospered. Well, this I think is a story about New Zealand dream, because it is about immigrants who came here, worked hard, and did quite well out of it. And so I think, you know, the Americans don't have the dreams all on their own. It involves 4 brothers from a modest background, young men in a young country, and they put their lives together through that. It concerns the second gold rush. It's not the first one, it's the second one, which was once the technologies had moved to where they could get into the rivers and flats, as we saw in the first lecture today, they were able to go back and look at areas that the miners who were standing in the river and digging with shovels, that they couldn't deal with. So they were really following the gold into the rivers and the river flats. So let's start. The McGeorge family comes from the Kawarau River in southern Scotland, and I'm not going to go all the way back. They immigrated to Australia as free men, I'd have to say, in the 1850s. Joseph, the father, his wife had died, he was left with 4 sons. He sent 2 of them out to Australia to see what it was like. They reported back well, and they moved to Australia. And they were farming in Victoria. And he had sons, and when there was a plague of caterpillars, and it ate them out of their farm, as those plagues in Australia in those days did. And so 2 brothers came to New Zealand because the gold rush was just getting started here, the first gold rush, when the miners were doing it with their shovels. Robert was involved in the gold fields in Carthage, and he was actually killed in an accident above Outram, and his body's in the Outram, his grave's in the Outram cemetery. And James, who's my great-grandfather, he worked initially in Carthage for the Crown Milling Company, what is now the Crown Milling Company, and he became eventually the chief accountant. So, great-grandfather Joseph, who married Isabella Crowe in Australia, and she was from Montrose in Scotland, so good Scottish on both sides there. They had they had 5 children, 4 sons, and a daughter. And I'm going to today, because this is a family that has lots of Johns and James and Josephs, etc., and they get abbreviated in various ways. I'm going to stick with their given names rather than calling John Jack, who a lot of people knew him as Jack rather than John, but I'm going to stick to it as John because I think it's simpler. So John and Joseph was my grandfather, and John is Norman's grandfather. They were both born in Victoria, and they came to New Zealand. Jean was born in Dunedin. Alec, who a lot of today will be about, was born in Dunedin, and James likewise. John was somebody who had engineering skills. He started out as a practical engineer, and he went to Australia. Is that working? Went to Australia, and he passed his exams for the Institute of Mechanical Engineers there, and he became a consulting engineer in mechanical engineering, particularly picked up skills in tramways and cable car activities, and that obviously became very useful when it came to designing dredges. Joseph was went into the drapery business, went to Australia. He actually raced penny farthings in Australia for a while, and then came back to New Zealand. Jean was somebody that my side and my family, I had really never heard very much about her. She was a spinster. I think it was one of those dreaded things that she was interested in a young man, but he was from the wrong church, and so she was not allowed to marry him, and so she remained a spinster for her life. And Alec was apprenticed as a mechanic, worked initially for Costons and Black and then Sparrow Brothers, spent some time in Australia, etc. James, he didn't do those sorts of things, and he in fact worked for his brothers on the dredges for some time, and then we heard Trevor this morning mention that he was involved up in the Tuckers Beach area. So in the 1890s, as Trevor has talked about, gold fever hit Otago again, because the technology had reached a point where the rivers could be worked rather than just the terraces, and so there was a great deal of gold fever, and the McGeorge brothers decided at that time, the three brothers, John, Joseph and Alec, they decided that they would look for opportunities that would be available. So, I mean, this gold fever was amazing. The numbers of dredges that were built in the time, I think according to the Institution of Professional Engineers, I'm going to hold this. It's working? Yeah. I think it's better to hold it. So the Institution of Civil Engineers has done a study on the dredges, and in 1901 there were 145 dredges working in the area, and there was something like 100 others being built. Now, I think it's fair to say that not all of those were profitable. So Alec the brothers had agreed to work together and look for opportunities to get in. Alec was doing his mechanical work, and he saw dredges being built and thought it was a good thing to get involved in. He had a little exercise where he went up to Deep Cove, Deep Stream I should say, and had a little dredge up there for a while. Then they came back and he and Joseph started working on dredges in the Central Otago area. And what they did was, whenever there were any opportunities, and the partners in these dredging companies changed quite a lot from time to time, and whenever there were any opportunities, they would buy shares if they could get them. And they were able to get some shares and bought shares in the Chicago and the Manihirakia. And in fact, my grandfather Joseph spent quite a lot of time on the Manihirakia dredge, because in manoeuvring on the river it actually turned over and it had to be refloated and reconstructed. In 1895 the brothers were at a picnic in the Cromwell area, and they were advised by some old gold miners that there was still good gold in the river, and they should think about doing something about it. And these people, Horns in particular, they had claims which they were prepared to make available to the McGeorge brothers. So in 1895 they decided to float their own company, and we've heard Trevor talk about floating, and they formed a company called the Electric Gold Dredging Company. Now, it wasn't electric in any sense of the word. Electric was a medicine that was used to relieve aches and pains at the time. It was probably snake oil in reality. And they thought it was a jazzy name, and it stuck, and so it became called the Electric Gold Dredging Company. So, not at all electric powered. They formed this partnership, and they offered shares, and they had quite a job getting rid of the shares. They took them around and tried to interest people in them, and they were only looking for £2,400 from 12 partners. And the story goes that Alec had trouble with his teeth for years, and he was up in this area, and eventually he was given an apple by somebody, and it caused him such grief that he said, "Damn it, I'm going to fix this." And he got on his horse, and 2.5 days later he arrived in Dunedin, and he went and saw Benjamin Throp, who was a dentist, and said, "I want them all out." And so he had all his teeth out, but while that was going on, he convinced Benjamin Throp to invest in the Electric Gold Dredging Company, something that I understand Benjamin Throp was always grateful to be involved in. He apparently then rode back up to Central Otago, and he said it was perhaps a bit premature, that it was a bit cold in the teeth, in the mouth, dealing with no teeth. Just a big venture for young men. These were men. Alec at the time was 28, and Joseph was 31, and John was 34. So these are young men getting involved in quite a big thing, floating a company to put a dredge on the river. And I should make the point that their dredging was in the river. It wasn't on the river flats as Trevor was talking about this morning, and there was a lot of dispute as to whether in fact they could dredge on the Kawarau in the river. They secured these claims, and I'm not going to go into all the details about that because, as I said, that makes the story. So they had the claims set, and number one, we're on the Kawarau, and I should just cover here. You can see Cromwell. I've got a pointer here, I believe. So this is the township of Cromwell. Here's the river running around here up to, this is Bannockburn here. Here's the bridge across the river at Bannockburn. And the McGeorge claims ran down in this area here. So, as I say, in August 1895, the Electric #1 dredge was put on the river. This was a dredge. It was designed by John McGeorge, with Alec obviously having some involvement as well. John was a consulting engineer at that stage, and so he designed the dredge for the brothers. It was erected in this area here, and Alec played a major role in the erection, and they got it going. Just a little bit on dredge theory for those who are not sure. What a dredge looks like, it basically is a floating vessel. It's got two pontoons that are separated, and this ladder of buckets comes in between the two pontoons. On the dredge, here's the boiler and the chimney. Here's the steam engine that provided the driving power, and it's driving up to the top of this chain of buckets, and the buckets just move around here continuously. As they come over the top, they drop into a sluice box, as Trevor was talking about this morning. That sometimes is a bit more complex than that, with rotating screens, etc. And then the remainder, after any gold had dropped out in this area, the remainder ran out down to the tailings area. And this is the most important part of the dredge. This is where the control of the bottom of the ladder takes place, and the loads in this are huge, because it's the weight of all these iron buckets plus the dirt that's being picked up. So you've got all those buckets are full of dirt, and so this control here was very important. The dredges had no motive power of their own in terms of moving along, and they had winches at both ends, and we'll see in further photographs, they actually pulled the dredges up the river using ropes. So the #1 dredge got started, and as soon as they got it started, they realised it was too small. And there's the #1 dredge. And as you can see there, this is the bucket end. That's that part I was talking about that's taking the load. Here's the housing for the boiler, etc. There are the buckets rising up, the top wheel. Here's a screen to screen out the large gravel, and then the smaller material drops onto a sluice box here, and the material comes out the back. Here's one of the lines, and you can't actually see the other lines. So the #1 dredge, as I say, they found it was too small. It couldn't get down to the bottom of the river. The river was tall high. There wasn't enough depth in the ladder part of it to get down, and so there were times when it just wasn't able to dredge. And the partners in Dunedin started getting pretty toey. There'd been a lot of expense in building this dredge. It had cost £2,400. They hadn't seen much yet, and they expected instant returns. And the whole thing nearly came to a stop at that point. To save their venture, Alec and Joseph climbed on their horses and rode to Dunedin, and sat down with the investors and made some agreements, and one of them was that another dredge master come on, because Alec had been running the dredge, and another one come on and run it for a while. But as Alec tells the story, and he told me this story when I was just a little boy at his place in Karitani. There was a horseshoe, and he had a horseshoe on the dredge, and he had it nailed on upside down. And one of the workers, a new worker on the dredge, came on board, took a look at the horseshoe and said, "No wonder this dredge isn't doing very well, your luck's all running out." And so apparently they turned the horseshoe around, and you know what the story is. And as I say, I can remember Alec telling me this story at Warioki, their house in Karatani, when I was just a little lad. So they immediately started, once they got this dredge going, they immediately started planning for a second dredge, and we will get onto the number 2 in just a minute. The number 1 dredge worked from 95 through to 1900, so only a period of about 4 years. During that time it recovered 7,600 ounces, and at £4 an ounce at the time, that's 30,000 pounds. So if you think about the numbers Trevor was talking about in terms of the exchange rates, still quite a lot of money. The number 1 dredge was beached, and as Trevor said, the good Scots people don't just leave it to wreck. They sold off the parts, and so that was the end of the number 1. The number 2 dredge, picture here, it began operations in July of '97 after having what Alec thought was a very slow construction period. He was a very intense man, and he wanted things to happen quickly, and his book tells lots of frustrations of getting this built. This dredge was a lot bigger than the previous one. The previous one had cost £2,400, this one cost £6,000, and it was only 3 years later, so inflation was virtually nil. And so it's a much bigger bigger dredge. This one recovered its costs in the first 10 weeks of operation. So it was free and clear, apart from obviously labour costs, after the first 10 weeks. Again, it was still thought not to be big enough for dredging on the Kawarau, particularly the area above Bannockburn, where they were very keen to go dredging. This dredge was worked by the Electric Company through to 1907, and during that period she recovered 17,800 ounces, which is now up to 71,000 pounds at the time at £4 an ounce, £4 an ounce. If you turn that into today's numbers, that's a pretty big number. I think currently gold's about $1,300 an ounce. So we're talking sort of 26 million at that level. So they moved on to building they built number 3 dredge. And this was still with the same electric company. And there's the picture of the Lady Ranfurly dredge. It commenced construction in '97, so only 2 years after they put the first dredge on, and it began operations in '98. This dredge again, although it's hard to tell from the picture, was much bigger than the number 2, where the number 2 dredge had cost £6,000, this one cost £13,000, so much bigger thing. Obviously too, the brothers had started to get good returns, and so they didn't have to use second-hand old things, so the costs were probably a bit higher than, say, the number 1. This was a very successful dredge. And you can see here, it's clear to see the mooring lines, and this is the way the dredge was winched up the river as it needed to go up the river. If it had to go down the river, they would put a line of chain on here and then start just winching it back down the river. And they moved these dredges up and down the river quite a lot. You can see here the coils of steel cable, which are for the mooring lines, and these were often old cable car wires, which were no longer used by the cable car because they were a bit worn, but were quite adequate for a dredge. But can you imagine a coil of that steel wire? So dealing with that, putting that into a dinghy and rowing up here to put these lines in and move them up to winch it up, quite a business. So this dredge was a much bigger dredge, as I've said. It was able to dredge the areas up above in the #1 claim, which was up above Bannockburn, this dredge enjoyed a return for the week ending the 7th of July 1902 of 1,250 ounces in round figures, in actually 4.5 days dredging. So, I mean, that's enormous. During the period October 1 to November 5, 1904, it recovered 3,570 ounces. So a very successful dredge. It was operated from 98 through to 1919 when the Electric Company was wound up. There's a picture, it's hard to see, but that is 1,200 ounces of gold being weighed in at the Cromwell branch of the bank, and this is the bank manager, various people oohing and ahhing over it, and this is James McGeorge, the other brother, who was the dredge master at the time when that recovery was made. The lady, I'm not sure, it's a Mrs. Stevenson, the wife of the manager of the bank. Interestingly, you imagine getting that amount of gold from the dredge, which is located out in the boondocks up the gorge a bit, but getting it safely to the bank. I understand, somebody told me recently, and I hadn't heard this story, but apparently they used to shoot rabbits as they drove the dray in with the gold, just to make people realise that they were all armed. Which I think is a very good story. Alright, now here's a picture, and it's in our front garden, and this is a dredge bucket off the Lady Ranfurly. And you can see it's quite a big construction compared, if you have seen dredge buckets around, and the very substantial bottom here. This was recovered from the wreck of the Lady Ranfurly, and the wreck is under the bridge effectively at Bannockburn. And before the Clyde Dam was filled, one winter when the river was low, my brother and another cousin and the local farmer went and they recovered parts off the dredge because they knew it was going to be buried. And so my brother recovered this bucket. He took it up to Christchurch because he lived in Christchurch, and eventually he said to me that he thought it ought to be back in Central Otago where it had come from. So I took my wee trailer up to get it. And there was another bucket to get at the same time, so I loaded these 2 buckets on the wee trailer and promptly realised I had to get to the nearest service station as fast as possible because the tyres were being squashed right flat. The only way to move this thing is with a forklift. 2 of us can just manage to sort of squirrel it around on gravel, but it's extraordinarily heavy. And if you imagine what the weight of a string of those hanging off the front of a dredge, enormously heavy thing. Just before here's a picture of towards the end of the Electric Company, or the directors, and this is my grandfather Joseph, and this is A.C. McGeorge here, Alec McGeorge here. Right, before moving on to the Waikaka story, I'll just finish off a little bit with my grandfather was married in 1897, and Alex was married a couple of years later. They came and lived in this area. They'd previously lived in huts beside the dredge, because the dredging, of course, was a 24-hour operation, so they had to do shifts. Both Alec and Joe resigned from hands-on work on the dredges at the end of 1899. Joe resigned first and Alec followed. They both claimed that the difficult working conditions were the reasons for it. My grandfather claimed that he wasn't a mechanical person, he didn't like the drenching, screaming noise that dredges make. And Alec claimed that he didn't like the dust that was blown across. But I think the real reason was they both had young wives, and the wives probably didn't like the hardships of the gold dredging area, and so they went to Dunedin. They opened an office in Dunedin, and although they stopped hands-on work on the dredges, they were the owners, managers for some years after that. They were quite wealthy young men by that stage with those sort of returns, and all three built or acquired large houses in Dunedin. I haven't bothered to show you those because I think that I decided that was not appropriate. And Alec and John in particular set about filling those houses up with children. My grandfather, he didn't do so well. He only had one son, so compared to the others, but we'll come to that in a minute. Now, some thoughts on dredging on the Otago Rivers. For me, it's putting this talk together has been well worth, because I've had to think about what some of the things they've gone through. They were operating on large, fast-flowing rivers. They were often dredging in the winter when the river was low. In the early days, because the dredgers couldn't reach down, so that and those winters were cold. In Alec McGeorge's memoirs, he talks about the winter when the young man was froze to death in his bed in the Bendigo pub. And he talks also that at that time chemists had a glass vessel in their window with coloured water in it. It was a normal thing for a chemist to have that. And apparently one in Alex or Cromwell froze. The glass fell off it because it broke when it froze, and it stayed frozen for 10 days. So imagine working out on a dredge in those conditions. Very dangerous working conditions. When they were out on the river. There were moving belts and buckets all around them because they didn't no drives. They were all belt drive, no shaft drives. It was all belt drives. Manoeuvring the dredges was hazardous. If you got those lines caught as you were winching the dredge up, if you weren't careful when you released the line, it could take you out. If you were on the inside of a bend and you prized it loose, that would come tight with a bang, and you would be going. Getting coal out to the dredges. These dredges had a considerable appetite for coal. But not only did the roads have to be built to wherever the dredge was, but then you had to get the coal out onto the dredge. Some of the times it was relatively easy. One or two of the pictures there, it was close by. Other times they had to basically float the dinghy down on a line, and so it came up tight alongside the dredge. A very hazardous operation. There was no electric light on these dredges. So when you were running 24 hours a day, at night you were dealing with hurricane lamps and things like that. And there's a story about my grandfather who, on his shift one night, had to climb up to the top of the gantry where the buckets came over to oil it. And when he was up there oiling it, the wind blew his hurricane light out. So he was standing there, and right beside him are these buckets going round, etc., and he didn't know what to do, so he came, a bit of thinking, decided the only thing he could do was to stay there, because the boiler fire would go out, and the boiler would run out of steam, and the buckets would stop turning. And then that would get the others awake, so that they would know that the dredge had stopped for some reason and come and help it get down. So that's a pretty hairy story, I think. Claim jumping. With the sort of hysteria that was going on, there was all sorts of claim jumping going on, and the McGeorge brothers had techniques when they made lodged claims in the warden's court, the way they signalled to each other so that the news rapidly got to the site and they pegged the claim before anybody else could get out there. They also used codes in their telegraphic communications so that it wasn't clear what was being achieved. They were somewhat secretive. There's a story how another dredge was making a lot of noise in Alex, I think it was, about getting 200 ounces for the week, and Alec took the man quietly aside and said, listen, you need to be quiet about this or you'll have everybody and their brother rushing into that. We've banked 600 this week, so just keep quiet. They also had no idea of what they were going to get, because there was no way to essay the river. Yet they were just dredging. They were moving up the river, and if you were on the lead, it was great. If you got off it, where was gold? Was there any more? So it was an unknown thing. So very, very doubtful business prospect. Getting people to go along with that. Managing the city shareholders, I think, was always an issue. Right, Waikaka story.